Okay, so now we're going to do a sample project. And I think this is important because not only are we going to go over some things that are really important, like kind of more advanced topics in terms of how to make your local environment work beyond just dragging files and opening them up in the browser, but also like going through the actual process of doing a project. How do we prepare to do a project? How do we get it organized in our head? What are the different steps? What are some typical issues that we might run into with such a project? So I think this is a really valuable little piece. So we're going to spend the next few lessons, I think there's 6 or so, that are going to be just making this project happen. And then after that, we're just going to move on to a bunch of general topics in map design, a bunch of general use cases that might apply to different maps that you do, and you won't have to watch all of them, but kind of on a case-by-case basis, depending what you think might be useful or apply to you, you can watch those. So this kind of serves as the capstone of the course in terms of really teaching you a lot. The rest is a lot of just extra detail to make you an even more advanced map maker. So we're going to do a pretty simple little project here. My goal is basically that we're going to map the number of McDonald's in each state in the US. And this is obviously, I'm just making this up, but I picked this, because there's a couple different things. We have to find the data. We have to find the US states. We have to find out how to count them within the right place. Like, how do we figure out how many McDonald's are in each state? How are the different ways that we can put that on a map? How do we color that or show it in some way? Maybe we do it with a pop-up, we show the number, or we color the polygons like from green to red based on how many there are in every state. And it's ultimately like a useful thing, like rather than, let's say if you worked for McDonald's or whatever, and obviously they already know how many are in every state, but if you really wanted to visually see how many McDonald's there are in different places in the US, you can see it instantly versus having a table of this data, which takes a little while to understand, and you have to actually deal with all the numbers. So, okay, what's the first thing that we do? Well, the first thing that I do when I think of a project like this is I create a README, what we call a README. And that's the first thing I want to do, is make a README where we're roughly going to talk about, where we write down kind of like, what do we need? And what are we making? And what's the design? And what's some of the tech stuff that we want to do with it? So my README, they don't have to be long, they're trying to just get us organized so we don't get too distracted along the way. It's very easy when you make a map, as I've mentioned before, to get distracted with little bells and whistles and miss out the core center of our map. The core center of this map is to make it obvious to any viewer where the most McDonald's are in the US and where the least are, to see the concentration, right? And who knows why we'd want to do that. So what do we say? I write the overall goal at the top, and then what is the data we're going to need? Well, we're going to need different McDonald's. We're going to need their locations, either by an address, and then get lat and long from that. And then we can find out through geographic analysis what state they're in, or we can just get the number per state, like if we can find the list of that somewhere, okay? And maybe we'll make a spreadsheet. We'll look at the data shortly. We're also going to need to get the state boundaries, because we're going to need to put these on the map, and state boundaries aren't just like a thing that comes with maps. We're going to have to get like a GeoJSON or something that contains all those polygons. For design, well, we could show dots for every McDonald's, but that isn't necessarily very easy to count. If there's 5,000 in New York, it's just going to be like one big blob, right? We could show the states and show a pop-up on mouse over with the number of stores. So as we move around the map, we see in a little pop-up how many. We could also color the states incrementally, which is what I was talking about. This is somewhat like a heat map idea, that we're coloring them based on the number of McDonald's in them. I like this as our ultimate solution, but it involves a little bit more challenge. So that's why we're doing this. In terms of the tech, we want to kind of pick what we're going to use. Are we going to use Leaflet or MapLibra? Well, either would do fine for this. It's just going to be your personal preference. I like using MapLibra. I think it's good for you to get used to those paradigms. They're a bit more advanced, but I think you would be able to do this in Leaflet. Probably a little bit easier in some ways, but yeah, there's going to be some parts that are trickier in MapLibra, but I want to, but for that reason, you're still with me, so I want to introduce you to those, because I think if you were to do this in Leaflet, you wouldn't need my help as much. You could just go watch the sections about polygons and things like that. But that's not to say this is easy. This is definitely, there are parts in this that are going to be complicated, especially if you're new, and then you're going to run into hurdles, right? So hopefully by going through this together, we can get a good sense of it. So let's get started in this first video on finding the data. Now, as I've mentioned before, you never want to underestimate finding the data. And I put it first here. I put it before we do the design or the tech. I'm not going to start a new file that's a new HTML file and start that way. I'm going to start with trying to get data. Okay, so how do I find this? Well, I know what I'm trying to find. So really, I just start going to Google. So I have a couple basic Google searches that I've just saved here that I'll just bring over. So number of McDonald's per state. And then that gets us to a bunch of places. Okay, so we could go to this Scrape Hero, the first result. But in this one, we have to like buy the data. So they say they have all these points, which kind of represent what the data is. So here's already kind of a cool little map. And to get the data set, well, they have some examples, but they don't have it all. So, okay, there's some stuff and there's a bunch of other data that they have, but we have to pay for it. Okay, so can we get around paying for it? Well, we can go, let's see, I found also when I was digging around, there's this Reddit post here where someone kind of did what we're looking to do. So this is kind of a cool example. So they actually show it with the number in it and they color it, which is kind of cool. Not a bad idea. So we could do it manually. We could literally make a spreadsheet and put in like Washington 251, Oregon 152, California 1165. We could do it all manually that way. Okay, but maybe we can find some kind of CSV somewhere. Maybe that could be a little easier to do, or something we can, you know, we can't just like copy paste this. We have to manually write it, which is kind of a pain in the butt. I also found this. This is all from the same search, just some different results here. This is that Statistica one. And we see again here, there's some numbers. They have this expanded. So again, we could copy these numbers, but we can't just like actually copy it. But there are these like downloads. So what is one of these downloads? Well, let's download the PDF. Oh, we need to register. Okay, so maybe there's some kind of payment, some kind of registration that needs to happen. You know, there's all this kind of stuff. Okay, then there's another example from this Google search, poking around. See how many McDonald's are in your state. And here we have this kind of, you know, there's a big list here. It says the population and it says the number of McDonald's in them. And actually that might be cool, right? Like McDonald's per capita, maybe that could be more fun. This is a little bit more copy pastable, so this isn't too bad of a start. But you know, again, we have to, if we paste this into a spreadsheet, it's going to be kind of a little bit wacky, right? So if I go to a Google Sheet, and let's just open on one that I'm using for a project here, and then we create a new sheet. Okay, and then we try pasting in this data. Yeah, it's kind of a mess. We're going to have to like, you know, do a bunch of clicking around and fixing stuff. So that's a pain in the butt. So also not great. So maybe I would search for, you know, tables of this data, try to find something that's more of a table. Now I ended up in all my searching eventually coming to a kind of spreadsheet, which is a bit out of date. You know, it's nothing, this isn't something that's really... you know, this website is clearly a little old, but this is like a table. So we can just really easily just grab this whole thing and just paste it into a Google spreadsheet. And that makes this really nice. Boom. And look at that. Each of them, it's in its own column. Okay, so this is a good place to start because we can change this into a CSV and eventually change that into a JSON, which we can use directly in JavaScript. Anytime your data is organized like this in really good columns and rows, it's going to be much, much easier to turn it into a usable format. When you just have text or whatever, you know, you can start with a spreadsheet. We're not going to actually use the spreadsheet directly, but turning this into the data we want is much easier because it's so formatted. It's so clear what goes where. And there's a bunch of other stuff in here that we don't need. Payday lenders, they're doing some kind of comparison here. We just care about the number of McDonald's and the state. And there we go. Now, in terms of the other piece of data that we needed, we need the state boundaries. So this is actually quite a bit easier because it's a very common part of data. It's a very commonly thing that's used. So I look up state boundaries USA GeoJSON, right? I want to put GeoJSON because if I look up USA, I'm going to get, pictures, I'm going to get articles about state boundaries, whatever. If I look up GeoJSON, that's telling Google, hey, I need that type of file. And there's, a few sources here. People are, okay, download it here. Well, this GitHub link, because we're used to GitHub, we know this is kind of like, this is going to be free, probably. And it's called usstates.json. So that's a good sign. So we open it, and actually it has, GitHub has like a map preview when it's GeoJSON data, when it's formatted like this. And so we can actually see this data. So here it is. We have Hawaii, and this data is not exact. Look at it. It's not right. It's not geographically exactly accurate. We have little chunkies that aren't quite right. But we have all the states, and it's not important for this map. Again, going back to the purpose, it's not important for it to be geographically exact. No one is going to look at this to try to figure out the boundaries of Hawaii. That's not what this map is about. So it's okay for it to be kind of inaccurate. So with these in place, with the, now we have like this spreadsheet that's just like this one, where we just copy this in, and we have the GeoJSON. Now we're ready to actually start doing the mapping itself. And we'll start that in the next video. See you there.